Welcome, everyone. My name is Rebecca Seaton, and I am a member of West Hartford Community of Concern, which is a group of middle and high school parents who work on bringing awareness and education about topics that impact the health and wellness of our kids. Last fall, another parent member, Sarah Barsak, and I began hosting monthly meetings for parents of tweens and teens with ADHD to have a space to talk about the experience with other people and share resources and to commiserate and celebrate the lows and highs around this issue. Julie Reed, who you'll meet shortly, is a West Hartford parent and does research on ADHD at the Institute of Living. And she reached out to connect with our group and told us about a presentation that she and her colleague, Dr. Michael Stevens, has that unpacks a lot about understanding ADHD. We thought this would be a great program to bring to our community, and by the number of people who signed up to come tonight or get the recording, it seems like this is a topic of interest. We want to thank our public TV station, WHCI, for broadcasting this program on the TV and YouTube channels. A recording will be sent to everyone who registered and can be found online. Manuela?
Hi, my name is Manuela Canales. I'm also a member of West Hartford Community of Concern and a parent of a child with ADHD. Today, Mike and Julie's presentation will be followed by a discussion starting around 8. Please put your questions in the Q&A. We will also have the option to use the raise hand button, and we will get to as many as we can until we wrap up at 8:30. Julie and Mike, would you please come on to introduce yourselves, and we will see you after the presentation.
My name is Julie. I, as Rebecca mentioned, am a West Hartford parent. My kids have gone through the whole system. I no longer have any at school, but I am the research coordinator for Dr. Stevens' ADHD study, one of a few that he's currently conducting, and have actually had several of the West Hartford students participate in the study. So I'm really excited to be here tonight and answer any questions that y'all might have about the actual study participation in case your kids are interested.
Great, thanks. And hi, I'm Mike Stevens. As Julie mentioned, I run a couple of research studies over at Hartford Healthcare. We have a neuroscience research center called the Olin Neuropsychiatry Research Center that has been working for about the past 21, almost 22 years to use all sorts of high-tech, sophisticated neuroscience techniques like brain imaging, EEG, and genetics to try to understand lots of different psychiatric and psychological disorders better, so we understand what causes them, and then also to develop new treatments for them. I'm here in large part because about a year or so ago, we sort of realized that it would be a good idea to start sharing a little bit of what we've learned about the studies we've done in ADHD over the past 20 years with our own staff, our own physicians and clinicians who actually work one-on-one with ADHD patients day in and day out. We learned that they don't really get much continuing education to keep up with research and what we learn year to year and decade to decade. And that very quickly snowballed because we also realized that there is a need for the community to hear a little bit more about what's going on. So what we've done today is we've prepared, about a 40 to 45 minute, maybe as long as an hour if I end up being kind of wordy, a presentation designed to be kind of an overview from start to finish about what we've really learned about ADHD, what causes it, how to diagnose it, popular misconceptions that we need to dispel and why, and moving into treatment options that current research tells us is really what we should be paying attention to when we think about trying to get treatment for ourselves or for our kids. Manuela and Rebecca have assured me that they're going to be moderating questions that are put into the chat or trying to get people to have the ability to answer some questions as we, at the end of the presentation, if we don't have an opportunity to get to them first. All right. So before I begin, I do, as I have with the several talks we've been giving to different community and professional groups over this past year, want to give some recognition and sincere thanks to Morgan Beatty in my group, who really was the person who helped put all the slides together and get all the material that we wanted to present into a useful, presentable form. Because goodness knows, if it had been left up to me, it never would have reached a point where I can actually share it in the way that we're going to go over today. It is always important to mention that what we're trying to do here is to be educational, to raise people's awareness and knowledge about ADHD as a disorder, its causes, its treatments. What we talk about today is going to be a really good summary of what research tells us. And I'm going to be a little opinionated about what I think best practice is for thinking about things. But I think everybody knows that if this talk is not the same as bringing your child or a family member to a treatment provider, although we will talk a little bit about your expectations in doing that. So you really should use medical advice the way it's intended by listening very closely to a healthcare provider or professional if you have any specific questions. And of course, if there is any medical emergencies, please call your doctor or 911. That's the standard disclaimer. All right, so let's get into this. I always like to start these talks with a few interesting facts to grab people's attention. Research has shown over the past several decades that a diagnosis of ADHD comes with very real world consequences. Some things that are often surprising to people. But if you have ADHD, you are much more likely, 1.5 times more likely, to get injured accidentally, falls, car accidents, etc. 37% higher crash risk as a driver. And interestingly enough, that's overall. If you actually take a look at research, it shows the first couple of months after a new driver gets their license, it's actually a 68% higher risk to get into a motor vehicle accident. 109% higher rates of alcohol-involved crashes. There's a higher chance that at some point in your life you'll engage in a criminal activity. The substance abuse risk, if you have ADHD, is conspicuously high. 1.7 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 2.5 times more likely to abuse cannabis, marijuana, twice as likely to use cocaine. There's been interesting studies that take a look at long-term financial security. A large study over in the Scandinavian countries that have records that are on everybody have taken a look at what the lifetime financial burden of having ADHD is in terms of how much money people earn. And they found that you are going to be 25% poorer than someone with non-ADHD by the time you retire. And there's all sorts of research that just go from life satisfaction to even really, really concerning risk of suicidality. That if you have ADHD, you have a much more likely chance of having a negative outcome. Certain socioeconomic studies that have tried to estimate the impact financially that people in the United States end up incurring because of the healthcare, educational, caregiving, societal costs, estimate that ADHD costs all of us somewhere between 143 to 266 billion dollars per year just to provide the services or deal with the consequences to education of the workforce. If you take a look at teenagers alone, that turns out that every ADHD diagnosed teenager costs the United States over $8,000 per year. So when people come to me and say, well, why do we care? It's not like these people have schizophrenia, which they can't function in society and they require institutionalization sometimes and all that. Well, this is still a very, very real, impactful disorder. But the problem is people don't understand what goes into ADHD. Our awareness of these facts is virtually non-existent. we decided about 2 years ago that we would try to learn what the public knows about ADHD. So we conducted a national internet-based study where we asked about 29 questions. They were divided up into the categories you see on the slide. Things about ADHD diagnoses or people's popular misconceptions about ADHD as a disorder. Things about treatment, about outcome, about what disorders are commonly comorbid or found to occur at higher rates with ADHD, even some just basic trivia like that. And this was an interesting survey. I won't get into a lot of how it was constructed, but we asked people whether these statements that have been proven time and time again by research, sometimes as much as 30 or 40 years ago was when we learned it. Things that arguably should have filtered down into public awareness, whether or not people knew something was true or not true. They also had the option of answering, I don't know. But here is pointing out, just in terms of when people answered the question, do you know the answer to questions about ADHD diagnosis or misconceptions or trivia? As you can see, this is essentially chance level. People were guessing, yes or no. They didn't really know these things. Accuracy is barely above chance for most things. I'm going to pull a couple of these out because they're interesting. Here's some of the best performing questions, because what you saw a second ago was an average. We asked 1,000 people out there, do kids with ADHD who do well in school, are they less likely to have their ADHD diagnosed? The answer is true. I mean, it really is. Kids who do really well in school but have ADHD often go unrecognized. But again, barely more than chance got it right. How many kids in the U.S. have ADHD? It's no longer estimated to just be a handful. It's as many as 10% of children in the U.S. meet the criteria for an ADHD diagnosis. Again, just barely more than chance. The best performing question was one that I'm fairly gratified. People understand ADHD medications do not cure ADHD. They only are a temporary control over the symptoms, and they have to be taken every day to see the effects. Almost 2/3 of people knew that that was correct, but that was the best we got out of this national survey. Touch a little bit on the lowest performance questions. 8 out of the 29 questions were answered with an average accuracy of less than 40%. So we're not even just talking chance levels of generally knowing or not knowing. We're talking about people who were misinformed, people who just absolutely generally knew the wrong answer. Thing number one, there are many more people with ADHD today than there were 30 years ago, and ADHD rates are increasing. Well, the answer to that is false. ADHD itself, the prevalence, has remained very stable. And this is different than what we've learned to our surprise about some other common psychological disorders. The rates of depression and anxiety, when you compare the rates today to say back in the 70s and 80s, it is demonstrably higher. And there's solid evidence to suggest that in our country, at least, and some evidence worldwide, people are more likely to be depressed and anxious. But they're not more likely to have ADHD. When you look worldwide at any country, the prevalence rates of ADHD are pretty consistent from place to place. People might believe this because awareness of ADHD has definitely increased from the 70s and 80s towards today, but the rates themselves are not increasing. People were asked whether or not people who are untreated with ADHD, are they more likely to have problems with their weight and obesity? And the answer to that is true. There is a proven link between untreated, unmedicated ADHD and problems maintaining a healthy body weight. But only 1/3 of the people out there knew that this was true. A big one. Using ADHD medications makes it more likely that someone will abuse alcohol or drugs later in life. This is a very common parental concern because people sometimes don't want to prescribe medications that are stimulants because they think it's a gateway drug. They think that the use of the medication is somehow very much like using illicit drugs of abuse, and that's going to condition their kid or make it more likely for them to use drugs later in life. The answer to that is unequivocally false. So that's not true. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. All right, so the last point, and then we'll move on. One of the things people did really poor on the survey as well was they didn't know that the symptoms of ADHD had to be present before age 12 in order to be diagnosed. So with that backdrop in mind, here's what we're going to cover today. What I tried to do was to give a sense of why it's important, why we have to be informed, and how wrong people typically are out there. And our goals today in this talk are to talk a little bit more about the misconceptions. If nothing else, I want, when people's attention is the highest near the beginning of the talk, to walk out of here knowing a few things that they absolutely shouldn't believe about ADHD. So if you can't say anything else from the presentation, at least know this handful of misconceptions are bogus. But then we'll get into what I think people might be a little bit more interested in. We're going to talk about the changing theoretical ideas about what causes the disorder, how we've related it to genetics and brain function and different models. We're going to go really kind of quickly to give you a summary of what we thought from, the 50s throughout the 90s until today, with the major ideas that drive researchers like me to understand the disorder and learn how to treat it better. But then we're going to shift a little bit into how to get a diagnosis and some of the issues that pose to be barriers about getting a proper diagnosis. And the other thing I think people are going to be really interested in is I'd like to present to you near the end of the talk a review of what evidence-based treatments exist for ADHD. And don't be surprised when I kind of hang on that word evidence. You'll always find someone who has an agenda for promoting one treatment over another. Either they offer it in their clinic, or they just firmly believe it, or they just like to take sides. I believe in the evidence. And what I'm going to present to you is a really thorough overview of what study after study after study tells us either works, or is on the horizon that looks like it's going to work, or is fully experimental but sounds really neat, or kind of has been disproven, and what you should think about if you consider those types of treatments for yourselves or for your family. So those are our goals. Right, so we've already touched on some misconceptions. Why are we back here? Well, I want people to understand that misconceptions are really what everyone is up against. Not just parents, not just people with ADHD, but they're also a bad problem for practitioners, for medical and psychological professionals. So misconceptions are myths. They're these incorrect facts, misrepresentations that we all walk around with thinking that they're the truth. And it can be almost anything. And despite this, people are highly resistant to even knowing the truth. Now, in our survey, when we took a look at misconceptions in a category, there was about 7 or 8 questions. People only got them right about a third of the time, a little bit better than that, which really underscores that we're walking around with absolutely backwards ideas about things that are actually fairly common and fairly basic. If people aren't educated about the misconceptions, well, for doctors, it can interfere with their practice. If they have the wrong beliefs about ADHD or what it looks like in boys compared to girls, or treatment or ages of onset, they may not be prepared or educated to provide a proper diagnosis, or they might not prescribe the right treatments. But for people in the public, simply perpetuating the stereotypes that we're all faced with, it might keep someone who could benefit from treatment from actually seeking that treatment, either because they think of ADHD diagnosis as something to be ashamed of, or they incorrectly believe that treatments don't work, or something like that. And it also can misguide patients in selecting the right treatment. So here are just a few of those things that I would want everybody to walk away from. Some are simple, some are more, I didn't know that. Sugar. A misconception is that sugar makes a kid's ADHD symptoms worse. This is not true. There is no known link between sugar intake and ADHD symptoms. When studies that arose back in the 70s and 80s that first suggested this have been re-examined using more rigorous methodology, they find that this is more related to other factors like diet or socioeconomic status. And it's really nothing about the molecule of sugar itself that does anything for an ADHD symptom. Note, I'm not talking about someone like whipping themselves up crazy on 30 Fun Dips and then having a massive glucose sugar crash. That's a problem for anybody. But there's no specific relationship between sugar intake and ADHD. There is a very dangerous misconception that floats around that ADHD isn't really a problem. It's not a real disorder. It's just cruddy parenting. Also false. What research has shown, and I'll get into this in a minute, is that ADHD symptoms are related to absolutely clear deficits and abnormalities in how the brain functions that lead to some cognitive difficulties that are linked to behavioral symptoms of ADHD and our social functioning. You can track all the way from the cellular level through the brain system level up into the behavioral level to find these relationships. It is likely that one of the reasons why this misconception is still around is that research does show that the most effective form of treatment is to train parents in how to understand how their kid with ADHD thinks and interacts with the world, and to learn to better to optimize that process, and to have the kid engage understanding their ADHD symptoms in a way that makes everything work better in their family and their lives. But it's not because they're bad parents. It's because the training helps understand them to be better parents.
Mike, if it is okay, before you go into the next slide, we have a participant with her hand up.
Yeah.
So if you can unmute yourself and ask your question to Mike, go right ahead.
I'm interested, excuse me, hi. I'm interested in hearing whether, with respect to sugar, is it true or false that a dopamine deficit in an individual with ADHD increases their craving or interest in sugar? So in other words, does sugar, so I definitely processed what you said about sugar. It doesn't, there isn't a link. However, does the body's response to sugar mimic the dopamine increase that an individual with ADHD is seeking?
Okay, so the answer to that is no. But I don't want you to feel that that's the question is too out there. Because of it, we're going to get in a couple of slides to some of the ideas about the reward system in the brain. And I'll go into a little bit more detail than I had planned to give you a really solid sense of that link, because that's what you're really asking about. The question you're asking is prompted by curiosity about sugar. But what it's really getting into, and there is a lot of research that makes a heck of a lot of sense, is that when we look at how things reward the brain and how people with ADHD might have differences in how they process rewarding information, that's becoming really fruitful area of research that we're learning a lot about. So I'll get into that a bit more if you can hold on to your curiosity a little bit for a few more slides. All right. So we've already talked about this last one. If I give my kids stimulant medications, they're going to get hooked on drugs later in life. And I mentioned before, there's no evidence for this. Research does exist, very credible, very persuasive research, that when you're treated, just in general, but even with stimulant medication, it notably decreases the risk of substance use disorder later in life. Untreated ADHD puts you at a higher risk of developing these disorders. It's a light switch. If you have concerns as a parent about your kid with lifelong drug use or experimentation that leads to later problems, treat them, whether it's a medication or not. So we're going to pause for a moment and talk just a little bit about ADHD and social media. because the interest level, from what I understood here, is mainly families of middle school and high school age children. So we live in an era where, I mean, they've never known worlds without social media, and it's such a dominant force. So if you take a look on TikTok and you look for a hashtag ADHD, you're going to find billions of views. And the point that I want to make might come as no surprise to parents. The content is garbage for the most part. And this is just an example. Here's a video of just some kid saying things you didn't realize could be ADHD. And I'm not going to play the video. That's not the point of this. But absolutely nothing in this video had anything to do with ADHD as a disorder, as the symptoms, the behaviors, etc. And what we have to realize is the take-home message isn't, oh my God, social media today, we'll just have to ignore it. It's that this is content generated by people who are mostly looking at this as an entertainment or as an expression outlet. And it's not that there's misinformation there. The thing to be aware of is this is where our kids are getting their information from. And social media has a very loud voice for these kids. So we have to be even more careful that the facts that we present to them are not speculative, that we know the ground that we're standing on is very firm, so that we can fight the misconceptions and misrepresentation. Also, curiously, just a couple of facts. I wouldn't be at all surprised if some of you are wondering if you should ask, does social media cause ADHD? It's not an insane question. We've just seen a bunch of headlines over the past 3 or 4 years where there is a very strong link between social media use and exacerbation of mood and anxiety problems, particularly self-image, a lot of bullying and things like that. It's a force. So far, the link between social media and ADHD itself causally is very tenuous. Doesn't mean we won't see something emerge, but I think what we're going to be finding is more like what some of the studies that have come out to date are saying. It worsens some ADHD-related behaviors. It doesn't cause someone who doesn't have ADHD to suddenly have ADHD. And here's 2 of them right now. A couple of them actually, not just 2. A couple facts that we do know from studies. Social media can contribute to poor sleep. And not only is this a contributor to depression, not only is this a contributor to poor school performance, when you don't get enough sleep, you don't focus as well and you're more distractible. If you don't have ADHD, maybe this is temporary and you get a better night's sleep the next night and you do better. But if you're already having problems with inattentiveness and distractibility, that can give you a much bigger hit so that it becomes more of a problem. There's another link, which goes back to the question about the sugar and the reward function, is that problematic social media use has been described as prompting addiction-like behavior. This is where social media absorption in someone with ADHD can take undue priority over the other things they need to do. And there are things that we're learning about how people with ADHD process information and process rewards that might make this more sticky. Little harder to pry Johnny away from the social media than someone with ADHD because it may consume him a little bit more. Those frequent, continual, minor rewards are highly attractive and very tough to resist with people who have ADHD. So I think that's enough about that. Let's switch gears a little bit. I want to give you essentially 50 odd years of ADHD theory in 4 to 5 slides over the next 5 to 10 minutes. We're going to start by making sure people understand that ADHD is not something that's sprung out of the ground 10 or 20 years ago as some myth that people tried to describe as explaining kids' behavior. Modern medicine had its first scientific journal description of ADHD back in 1902. A guy named George Still wrote the first study describing kids with ADHD. So you may look here, if you're following the slide itself, as a product of the post-Victorian sensibilities of the time. They incorrectly attributed these behaviors to deficient moral control. So it was sort of a religious moral type of a thing. Yeah, we know that that's not true. 50 years later, it's worth noting that essentially the guidebook for psychiatry and psychology, it's a book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I'm sure a lot of you who are listening know about this, but some of you might not. It's essentially a big encyclopedia that describes every psychological diagnosis, the behaviors you need, the criteria you need. It's a map that says this is what a disorder is and this is what it isn't. They put the first of these together back in the early 50s. ADHD was listed even back then, 75 years ago. It was called minimal brain dysfunction because they had at least moved from this incorrect idea that it was all about moral character. And they suspected there was something about these behaviors that related to how the brain worked. But to be fair, they didn't really understand. They thought it was a lot less common than it was. Their ideas were that maybe it was related to brain trauma or caused by viruses or illnesses. Because remember, this is back in the 50s where people were just beginning to understand bacteria and viruses and how they could impact people and leave lasting problems throughout life. Flash forward 10 years. Medical committees formed a task force to study this. Flash forward another almost 10 years. We reached the second edition of this DSM manual for psychiatry. It now had enough evidence from study that ADHD was called hyperkinetic reaction of childhood and adolescence. And this is just a fancy schmancy way of saying these kids move too much. Hyperkinetic. But they did also start filling in some gaps. They recognized that this just didn't spontaneously occur in adulthood, that it was a disorder that arose in childhood. They also recognized that it was in a lot more people than was previously thought. Flash forward another 10 years to the third edition of the DSM. This is where we got our modern terminology of attention deficit disorder with or without hyperactivity. People popularly refer to it as ADD or ADHD. If you want to be one of the cool kids and you want to be in the know, you'd recognize that those are not official titles. People still use them. We know what you mean. When you say ADD, you're talking about somebody who doesn't have a lot of hyperactivity or impulsivity. Professionally, the field for 30 years has moved to a single umbrella term of ADHD. But what we recognized 1994 and then reified back in 2013 with the third and fourth editions of the DSM, that we have subtypes, or as they're called today, presentation. And this is the curious thing. The past 20 years while I've been doing my research, the field was very undecided about whether these were different disorders or the same disorder. Hence the name, the changing of terminology from subtype to presentation. It's pretty well agreed upon now that they are the same disorder. What we see is that as kids get older, they can actually bump into and out of these different presentations for reasons we don't understand yet. But it does seem like there are these trajectories that are influenced by circumstances, a kid's environment, their stressors, their problems, things like that. It may just, in some cases, make ADHD symptoms generally worse. But some kids end up having more or less hyperactivity and impulsivity or inattentiveness as they get older. This is coupled with a very solid understanding that in general, as kids get older and reach adulthood, into adulthood, symptom severity generally wanes. Not always, but generally. Only around 7 in 10 to 8 in 10 kids with ADHD fully meet ADHD criteria as adults. But that's a lot. And what you find is of the ones who don't fully meet ADHD criteria as adults, they usually have several notable symptoms or are somewhat subthreshold. That said, it is possible for a kid with ADHD diagnosis to essentially lose almost all or all of their ADHD-like symptoms by the time they hit adulthood. Again, for reasons we don't well understand. So what do we believe causes all of this? What gives rise to these symptoms? How do all these pieces work together? Well, I said a minute ago, ADHD is recognized to be a neurodevelopmental disorder. Let's start with genetics. ADHD is one of the most heritable, genetically determined disorder. It's above almost everything else, except for some of the mood disorders and psychosis and stuff like that. It's a 70% heritability rate, which is like the risk of a parent having ADHD with a child having ADHD. This is monumentally strong, I guess, is the simplest way of putting it. It's like an elephant in the room in terms of the strength of genetic relationships that we neuroscientists typically get interested in. So it's really, really strong biological basis. Well, how do we make sense of it? I'm not going to give a 2-year lecture of genetics in just 1 minute, but a soundbite is the genes that we have help build brains. They set up how cells work, all the little complicated functions. They sometimes guide how cells talk to each other. They create conditions that as we grow from infants to toddlers to school-age kids to adults that have our brains interacting with the stressors in the world and nutrition and all these things in an interactive way with the environmental aspects that we get to shape how our brains process information and our ability to manage our behavior. That leads to what we can measure with things like fMRI and EEG and other techniques to quantify the shape, structure, function, or the relationships of those things with behavior in the types of studies that we commonly do at my research center. Interestingly, throughout that whole summary, I haven't told you anything useful about how we actually use that understanding. So let me give you just a brief historical perspective. In the late 90s, early to late 90s, one of the more important advances that we had in understanding ADHD was by an ADHD clinician and researcher up at UMass named Russell Barkley. He published some of the first popular books that people could get in bookstores about ADHD and what caused it. And what Russ did for the field was hugely influential for researchers. There was this tendency at the time, and there still is, to try to find one cause. You've got a disorder, I'm going to find the cause. So people were looking for one thing about the brain, or they were looking for one way to describe behavior. And people started advancing theories that, oh, well, it's the frontal lobe of the brain and people can't inhibit their behavior. This is a cognitive model of ADHD. And people sometimes call it a neurocognitive model because you're relating the brain to the cognition. What people missed in these early days was that there's a lot of different ways you could be said to not be able to slam the brakes on an unwanted behavior. And this is what Russ helped the field with. Russ was one of the first people to say, okay, well, let's break this down a little bit. ADHD might be caused by, sure, the inability to inhibit this impulse you get, but it's also likely related to other executive or cognitive problems that are kissing cousins of the inhibition. He proposed, what was it? I believe he proposed that the inability to interrupt an ongoing response and the inability to protect yourself from being distracted by something else that was competing for you to respond to it. And what he tried to do was still link all those things to the frontal lobes. But it was the first step where we realized, well, wait, these neurocognitive models are really useful, but they're probably not simple. The next big advance was when ADHD researchers realized that it might not just be executive abilities, and it might not just be the clues we get about the neural circuits that are involved about slamming your brakes on unwanted behavior. It was also probably about how the brain processes rewarding information. It's a very busy slide, and I don't mean for people to pay attention to a lot of the actual details. What it's here to reflect is really that people organize these ideas from executive related brain areas, leading to behavior, leading to things that contributed to or caused ADHD, or reward behavior, leading to very specific ideas about things that might be processed differently about rewards for people who are diagnosed with ADHD, and how that led to the symptoms. But the key point that I want people to take away with is not one thing, two different neural pathways. So everyone's got that. This idea is about 20 years old. It actually was the theoretical premise of my first ever big time multi-million-dollar NIMH neuroimaging grant, was to provide the first neural evidence that these things that were observed at the time only on a behavioral level, we could actually isolate which parts of the brain and how they were working that conform to these two pathways. But that's not exactly what we believe today. It's only 10 to 15 years later, and we've got a very different idea. Again, the point of this slide is not for people to memorize all these different diagrams. It's to show that if you start looking across the hundreds of different brain imaging studies done with all sorts of techniques to take a look at structure or function or the neurotransmitters that are squirting around between different brain regions to help it communicate, and you couple that with what we've learned in dramatic leaps and bounds from the 2000s to today in how the brain operates, there is evidence everywhere, almost in every major system of the brain, that there's something abnormal in people diagnosed with ADHD. So this is a little picture from a 2009 review paper. And the point is to say that if you look at brain regions related to attention, those are these green things and how they talk to each other, there's some problems, both in the attention network and this network for cortical striatal network involved with response inhibition. If you take a look at executive functions, those are the brake stopping, the holding things in mind, the set shifting, the shifting back and forth between behaviors, the preventing distraction, there's a whole umbrella of different things we consider to be executive that guide and supervise behavior. These are the blue areas on this thing. There's evidence that those brain regions have abnormalities as well. There's evidence that the way that the frontal lobes talk to the subcortical structures that talk to the cerebellum involved mostly in movement and timing and coordination and dealing with tracking the passage of time. Abnormalities there. And then also the reward network. Since 2009, we also now have some evidence for sensory processing deficits and even flat out motor planning or motor execution deficits. Wait a second. That's everything. It's pretty much everything that's in the brain. We got from models in the early 90s looking for one problem, one causal thing, with hundreds of studies that are really well done, finding evidence left and right for things. Dear God, how do I make sense of this? And so I think this is the final idea that I'm going to give you about what we think about ADHD today. It can be different for different people. And I'm going to repeat that. We no longer believe ADHD is one disorder. We believe that the symptoms of ADHD, the hyperactivity, the impulsivity, the inattentiveness, they represent a behavioral expression that could have many different pathways to get there. We're still figuring out those pathways. In fact, one of the studies, the one that Julie coordinates, is designed to try to understand one of those pathways. That's the reward system stuff in detail. To figure out if there's information we can assess that will say that if we can quantify that this kid over here has this cause for ADHD because the reward system is functioning a little differently, maybe they'll respond better to a set of treatments over here. Whereas maybe a kid who has another constellation of brain function signs might respond to a completely different group of treatments. That's the hope. That's the path forward that many people who are at the cutting edge of understanding ADHD research are starting to investigate sort of full force. How well do we get that? Honestly, what we can take home is more about what we see clinically, what we see in the real world. And we're going to try to match those presentations up with these ideas about neural systems and how we cause it. So I love this screen. And again, a shout out to Morgan and my group. I thought this was the greatest way of illustrating. Your heads right now should be somewhat of a reflection of this highly disorganized. In the very middle, you think, okay, look, I get it. I knew about ADHD somewhat when I came into this talk. There are inattentive symptoms, there are hyperactive symptoms, and some kids have both. Great. But then there's this mix. Things that are key features, things that are psychiatric comorbidities that could be diagnosed, and then all of these behaviors. Oh my gosh, how do I organize it? How do I make sense of it? Do researchers even have a clue how we can start making sense? And we can. What consistently comes through, study after study after study, is that riding on top of the DSM symptoms are three major areas of things that might be a problem for someone diagnosed with ADHD. But in another person, they might not. These are issues with exerting effort and being motivated to do things that you need to do. Mood symptoms. And by mood symptoms, it's that constellation of mood, anxiousness that we've recognized more and more over the last 20 years actually have common biological origins. And then cognitive deficits. Sort of weak or sometimes even measurably impaired performance on any number of cognitive tests that we sometimes give in psychological evaluations. Those are the three key features that come up reliably. Does this mean someone with ADHD can't have something else? No, of course not. People are people. Everybody has their own stuff, but this is linked to the disorder itself in such a reliable way that it deserves to be put onto a what do we know now slide. On top of that, you often see the co-occurrence of these four disorders. Measurable depression, diagnosable anxiety, diagnosable conduct problems, and learning disabilities of various sorts. I organize these things in part because we suspect they're kind of related in these order. The symptoms are probably more related to these features. The features are more related to the comorbidities. And there's less of a relationship, we think, between the core symptoms of ADHD and these other comorbidities. But the jury is out on that. Let me just walk you through what this means. Here's Johnny. Johnny might walk into the clinic, parents think he has ADHD, and he's predominantly hyperactive impulsive. He's got some problems with his mood, and he also shows some impairments on a few cognitive tests. He's diagnosed with a reading disability, and he acts out a lot in school, gets into a lot of fights. This kid has ADHD. Here's Susie. Susie doesn't really have hyperactivity and is not very impulsive. She's more dreamy and distractible and attentive. Doesn't really have problems with her mood. Absolutely smart as a whip, but she really can't motivate herself. She doesn't engage very well. She gets cranky when people force her to do stuff. And she tends to be a little mopey. So she gets anxious about her performance, and at times her parents worry a lot that her mood is really keeping her back, even though they're not clear whether or not it's actually diagnosed. but no problems acting out, no problems with learning, nothing like that. Guess what? Susie also has ADHD. Finally, here's Timmy. Timmy's got both hyperactivity and inattention, doesn't have any cognitive problems, absolutely loves what he does. He's exuberant, but he does struggle with his mood. He gets very frustrated by his failures at school or when the kids make fun of him for always being impulsive and he's the butt of a lot of jokes. That sometimes leads him to be kind of depressed, and they've considered putting him on some antidepressants at times. And even though he performs fine on cognitive tests, he's really, really struggling with basic reading skills in school in ways that affect his self-esteem. Timmy also has ADHD. I put these up here sort of to just really drive home the fact. What the researchers summarize that I've tried to give you is really just trying to pull things together in a way that says that there's variability. Take home message. There's no test for ADHD. There's no blood test. There's no brain scan. There's no cognitive test. We've researched this for 50 years, and there's a lot of well-replicated signs of ADHD. We call them biomarkers in research. The closest researchers have ever gotten is a way to use EEG. That's the wires glued to your head looking at brain waves and little teeny fluctuations of electrical impulses that propagate up through the skull to the scalp. The FDA has approved one signature through EEG, but not to diagnose, nor to rule it out, only to confirm an ADHD diagnosis, which really is the FDA's way of saying close but no cigar. So there's a relationship there, and it's useful information, but it's not a test. It's at best confirmatory. And I also like to make the point, because one of the frequent questions I get is who should be doing my diagnosis? In-depth neuropsychological testing. And I started to say this because that's how I was originally trained. I was originally a clinical neuropsychologist before I started doing research. It's not sufficient. A cognitive test profile only helps. There's absolutely no signature on cognitive tests. Just because someone does poorly on a continuous performance test of sustained attention does not give you the diagnosis. And just because someone didn't do poorly doesn't mean they don't have the diagnosis. The American Association of Pediatrics makes it really clear what you have to do a proper diagnosis. You evaluate the symptoms. You've got to meet it in more than one setting. You've got to get your information both from parents and other professionals like schools or things like that. And you have to make sure it's not something else. That's the diagnostic process in a nutshell. The symptoms, everyone kind of recognizes this, who's interested in ADHD. Inattentive symptoms include making careless mistakes, difficulty sustaining attention, trouble listening, failure to follow through on work, difficulty organizing, a reluctance or unwillingness to kind of do things that are perceived as hard, but you have to sustain your mental effort, frequently losing things, just being dreamy and distractible, and being forgetful. It's not news to anybody who has a family member with ADHD or has ADHD themselves. Hyperactivity includes fidgeting, leaving your seat frequency in classroom settings, or a subjective feeling of restlessness as an adult. Difficulty relaxing, this feeling like you're always on the go, or parents observing that Johnny just never sits still, he's always doing something. Excessive talking, blurting out answers, difficulty waiting in turn, or interrupting. Here's the problem. It's easy to say this. It's easy to summarize this. But mapping your behavior or your child's behavior to these symptoms can be challenging. And what the proper diagnosis requires is someone who has experience with ADHD. So here's one of my bottom lines. People always ask me, is it okay to get a diagnosis from a pediatrician who's not a psychiatrist or trained specially in psychology? Sometimes, yes. Is it best to get it from a neuropsychologist? Sometimes, yes. What about any psychiatrist? Is any psychiatrist or psychologist good enough? Sometimes, yes. Oh, my social worker had said she had a lot of experience. Is it okay to get a diagnosis from a social worker? Sometimes, yes. What you're looking for is someone who actually has experience with ADHD. Not all pediatricians do. Not all psychiatrists do. The level of lack of knowledge in our own physicians at Hartford Healthcare was somewhat daunting, that there were basic things that they did not know about ADHD. And they very valued the professional training to bring themselves back up to speed. The bottom line is, you want to discuss the symptoms with somebody who you believe credibly understands the disorder, understands what ADHD is, what it isn't, who can help match the severity and the types of symptoms, that can understand that while you may think Johnny Feel is driven by a motor, can walk you through and get concrete examples and really understand whether his behavior is abnormal, is different than his peers, and really help you gauge whether it's causing difficulty. Because you can have somebody who's ADHD-ish, but do they really have the disorder if their life is going fine? It's a very hard call. And that's the type of professional you need. And this is somewhat daunting for people to hear as well, because they want to hear just a cookbook. They want to say, I want to go here, I want to go there, I want to get that, and then I'm done. A typical ADHD diagnosis is not one-stop shopping. You're usually engaging the school systems, you're dealing with outside professionals, you sometimes get specialized testing, you get referred to a lot of different treatment sources. Everybody seems to offer a different treatment or a different take. And in a very discouraging way, it's almost like you have to chart the course yourself and get a consensus. And I know exactly how frustrating that can be for parents who are just struggling to do what's best for their kid. Let's talk about treatments, and then we'll open it for a little bit of Q&A. What do professional organizations recommend as the top-line treatment? If this was a live audience, I would do one of these fun little raise your hand if you think it's medication. And then when 2/3 of the people raise their hands, I go, nope, sorry, it's actually not medication. The frontline treatment is actually behavioral parent training. This is what I mentioned earlier. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, behavioral parent training is the process by which therapists meet regularly with families to get an idea about how ADHD is affecting that family's functioning as well as the kid's functioning. And then several sessions over time are given, sometimes with groups of families, sometimes individual members, with a focus on educating everybody how ADHD behaviors work and coaching people to view the behaviors differently, to view them pretty much as just the way someone functions, and learn strategies to help the person with ADHD and their family members have more positive, productive interaction. And it's a cyclic process, it's monitored, and it works. It actually works quite well. The focus is not so much of eradicating the ADHD symptoms, and it's more of this accepting idea to say, look, everybody behaves the way they behave and for the reasons they've got. Some of my behaviors are driven by this thing people call ADHD. I'm going to learn about it. I'm going to learn the things that sort of get me into hot water. I'm going to learn the ways that I can keep performing best in school. I'm going to learn how not to fight with my siblings and the ways that we can avoid that. And what you find is that it generally improves symptoms and functioning. Next, medications. A lot of people hate medications. I don't like to take Tylenol for a headache unless I just absolutely have to. But it is inarguable that they work for a lot of people diagnosed with ADHD. And there's a lot of them these days. Most of them fall into this class that we call psychostimulants. The psychostimulants work a little bit by increasing extracellular levels of dopamine, typically. It goes back to the question about the relationship of dopamine and sugar and reward. They have rather strong effects on symptoms, but the research has also shown that other associated problems they improve as well. When you use medications, your risk of accidental injuries goes down by almost 1/3 in some studies. Motor vehicle accidents go down 1/3 to half. Your risk of criminality goes down by 1/3. Your risk of substance use disorder goes down by 1/3. your risk of depression goes down by 20%. So medications are often thought of as a benchmark treatment. They only work for 3 out of 4 people, though. Some people do not respond to the traditional psychostimulants, but they do respond to some of the other non-stimulant drugs that work on slightly different neurotransmitter systems. Talk for a minute about treatments that we're pretty sure don't work. Social skills training arose in the 80s, and it was a very simple idea, is that if you teach someone to do better socially, they'll have better interpersonal function. And the studies that were done back then show that there's really no improvement in social skills. There's really no improvement in social skills or ADHD behavior or anything. It's not enough to just teach someone what an appropriate social interaction is. There's more to it than that. And this is in contrast with some very interesting school-based research that shows that it's actually the peer relationships themselves that do the treatment. It's not simply knowing the skill. I'm going to make some people in the audience probably gasp or gnash their teeth with this next one. Diets generally do not work for ADHD. There's a few important caveats here. What we talk about with dietary approaches for ADHD is this idea that maybe it's the additives in the food, or maybe it's the saturated fats, or maybe it's the omega-3s they're lacking. There's something that's going to help my kid and it's going to cure his ADHD behavior. There's one diet called the, I can't even say this, oligo-antigenic diet, that there's pretty convincing evidence that if you eliminate some of these foods that causes this antigen sort of immune response in kids, that there is a pretty remarkable turnaround for those kids. But it's a really involved diet. It's really grueling, and it probably is the exception. But like I said earlier, there seems to be a lot of things that cause ADHD. So maybe this does work for some people. And I think that's the theme I'm about to get into with treatments that do work and that are emerging. This evidence is what science needs to be able to recommend a treatment is worth trying. It's a group. But if you've got 100 people in a group, all of whom have ADHD, but we suspect not all of them have the same brain function or the same causes, you got to get a lot of people responding before you can make a conclusion that this is a recommended treatment for everybody. And even then, you're still going to see a lot of people who don't respond. So evidence is crucial. And the evidence that we've got is really pointing the way to which things we should pay attention to. Here's a summary of promising treatments. I don't want to get into this too much in the interest of time. An effect size is a statistical term. It basically says something is not very big enough to pay attention to, or whoppingly huge. Oh my God, why aren't we doing this all the time? We call that an effect size, the measure of how oomphy a treatment might be. This is a really useful summary of some emerging treatments over the past 10 to 15 years. There are a half a dozen exercise-based treatments where people with ADHD are encouraged, often in school settings, to get up and move, train their bodies. It's not bodybuilding, but it's like coordination, movement, activity. And it's really strong evidence that there are noticeable effects on inattention, impulsivity, hyperactivity, even some effects on mental flexibility. One of my favorites is cognitive training. People are probably familiar with things like luminosity. The intensive drilling of different cognitive tasks is supposed to change how your brain is wired. And the hope is that it'll reduce your ADHD symptoms as well. One of our active studies is developing a brand new type of cognitive training for ADHD, because one was introduced about 20 years ago that lots of people got hugely excited about. And study after study after study says, small effect size. It's kind of sort of working for a few people, but not enough to really believe that we've captured what's going on. We have a new flavor of this. What we find, and usually these studies are trying to train the amount of information you can hold in mind, it does seem to help inattentiveness, has no effect on hyperactivity or impulsivity. And of course, your working memory gets better. But what we want is a cognitive training study where your ADHD symptoms go down and your other functional ability also goes up. And that's what we're working on right now. Training people to organize better. It does affect attention. And no surprise, you organize things better because you've really been drilled how to organize. So it's not worth dismissing. The thing that may be surprising to people is that mindfulness and meditation has emerged as a front runner promising treatment. Dozens upon dozens, literally dozens upon dozens of studies in school-age children, teenagers, college students, and adults all show a notable benefit in inattention and impulsive behavior. Evidence isn't strong for just the strict hyperactivity, but functional level and functional level goes up and symptoms go down from what has turned into off-the-shelf manualized treatments. They're offered in group settings. They're offered in standardized formats. People can be taught to do this in a way that's been proven to reduce ADHD symptoms. So these are the promising ones. The promising ones that not even really worth mentioning too much is there are some associated problems that some of these things address. Maybe there's something there. Exercise might improve motivation. It might improve working memory, at least in some people. Organizational skills training might improve academic performance, at least in some people. There's a little bit of evidence that some forms of cognitive training in ADHD improve generalized executive supervisory cognition, maybe in some people. Things that are on the horizon. Brain stimulation. Two big forms of brain stimulation. You can zap the brain with transcranial magnetic stimulation. That's when this is what's illustrated in this picture if people can see it on those screens. This is the thing that's been FDA approved for depression for about 10 years. It's been approved for OCD for 6 or 7 years. Forget exactly how long. And people are working on it with ADHD. The idea that this magnet induces electrical field and it makes your neurons fire. And the idea is you're strengthening your neuronal muscles and you're making brain regions talk to each other and it's helping. So far, we haven't succeeded. We're about to start a new study in a month or two where we're going to try a new brain target for this in the brain's reward system rather than just the frontal lobes. We're going to see if that shows some possibility. The other way of zapping the brain is by electrical activity. It's called transcranial direct current stimulation. It's a very low voltage thing. You put in these huge sponges on the brain and they just kind of induce this electrical current. And they don't drive the neurons. They just make neurons more likely to fire. So they kind of give a boost to anything that your brain was being used to do to begin with. And you can target it somewhat. It's a little bit coarser than TMS that can get really, really focal. But both of these have a couple of dozen studies so far. It's promising, but there's so much variability that the fields themselves of people who study TMS and TDCS are still working out about the best way to deliver the stimulation. And they need to work those things out more before we really get some success stories in ADHD. But there could be something there, something to pay attention to. Neurofeedback. I have very mixed feelings about neurofeedback. It's been around for more than 40 years. It is ridiculously well studied. A lot of the studies from the first 20 years just weren't good. They were too small. They were flawed. There's always a problem with them. If you discount those studies and you look at the ones that came over the next 20 years, there seems to be something there. There's variable results for reasons we don't understand. A lot of people look at the evidence and say, I can't recommend neurofeedback because it's just not enough oomph in the scientific evidence to be able to say that trying to modify your brain waves by looking at a screen and achieve some result really works. I think I take a much fairer view Knowing what we now know about how ADHD people are different underneath the hood, that literature probably suffers from the fact that we're just dumping everybody into a big group. I'm unaware of any study that's tried to look for responder subgroups and tried to say, well, who are the kids who do well? And how can we study them and understand how to get kids like that to take neurofeedback and seek other treatments for kids who are not like that? And I think as soon as the people doing this research turn that corner over the next 5 or 10 years, we might be a little bit more encouraged about not just using neurofeedback, but knowing when to choose neurofeedback. If you want to be strict about it right now, neurofeedback is still experimental despite 40 years of actual study. We just haven't turned that corner, which would allow physicians and the people who make these decisions about recommending treatments to be able to say that it's likely to be efficacious. These are my shameless promotion slides. We have 2 really massive multi-million-dollar studies going on right now about ADHD in teenagers. The first one is we are looking to figure out all these different types of kids that might have the reward system function in different ways. We do not believe that there's one little thing going wrong with the reward system. We think there's probably as many as 3 different types neurobiologically whose reward systems are working in characteristically different ways from each other. We're trying to establish that in this study, which we've got about another year and a half left in. And then we're going to try to match those people in future studies with treatments that seem more efficacious potentially, whether they be medications or non-medication based treatments. Then we're also doing the new phase. It's a replication study for that cognitive training thing I said I was interested in. We have a new flavor of cognitive training where we're not just trying to help people improve the amount of information they can cram into their short-term memory, but how they manipulate that information. Because we had some very strong evidence in a neuroimaging study about 5 or 6 years ago that linked very specific brain regions involved with the manipulation of information in working memory to reductions of symptoms, inattention, and hyperactivity for the people who responded in that way. We just completed a 2-year, $1.5 million study that showed we are getting the brain changes from a new form of treatment that we anticipated. We're about to start a brand new 3-year clinical trial trying to bring teenagers in to do this treatment and link those brain changes to symptom reduction. It's literally going to start in a week or 2, I believe. So that's it. If you want information about those opportunities, please reach out to Julie. And what I'd love to be able to do is, in the time we've got left, turn this back over to Rebecca and Manuela. And hopefully there's been some questions in the chat, or people might feel free to ask me to expand on anything they really want to know more about.
When you look online about what the issues are for folks with ADHD, when you hear about it, there's a lot of negative messages out there. You're going to fail at finance. You're going to be, addicted to something. You're probably not going to do well in school, and you're going to lose your jobs left and right, and your friends are going to hate you. And so I'm wondering, I'm just curious about what kinds of positive things, let's say science-based positive things, we can, deliver to our kids. Like if somebody, what can we tell them that, yeah, okay, you're different, but here are your superpowers, or here are the things that you know where I'm going with this.
I do know where you're going with that. Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways we could talk about this. What you're really coming down to is messaging. Mm-hmm. And it is true that mental health is stigmatizing. It's always been stigmatizing. It remains stigmatizing. I'm personally encouraged in some ways by generational shifts that I've seen. The Gen Zers tend to be a lot more open, at least so far, in their attitudes about stuff like this. But at the same time, we're up against a tsunami, aren't we? As soon as kids get into middle school, and certainly by the time they get into high school, even if they don't realize their lives become about conformity, in many ways it does. And being different in any way makes you feel different or not as good. So as parents, I think our job is to really push the message of acceptance. And I don't, oh God, what's the right way to say this? It doesn't sound stupid. I don't believe the typical teenager truly appreciates human variability. They don't appreciate this huge patchwork of different people who are out there. Adults have problems doing that, but it's difficult for them to wrap their heads around this idea that being different just means you're different, and that maybe you don't pay attention as well in some things, but you're perfectly good at doing other things. I think the messaging starts there. And the rest of it, I tailor things to the kid. When I recommend parents how they interact with certain kids, it's very much along the lines of that outline of behavioral parent training. I think you can tell I'm a fan of the behavioral parent training. Is that you learn what a kid's struggles are and you learn what their strengths are. I love the fact that you call them a superpower, because anything can really be a superpower. You know, I got two kids, they're very different in their personalities. And my youngest, I'd say her superpower really is that she's just the sweetest damn thing ever. She just really has a hard time being mad or angry or feeling short about anything. She's got other issues that are not as rosy as that, but some people wouldn't look at that as a superpower. I do. So messaging really boils down to reminding kids they will grow into an appreciation of differences, capitalizing on their strengths, reminding them that stigma is what other people believe, but your self-worth and self-image are what you believe, and that you can't be responsible for everything that everyone else not only you think are thinking, but really just might be thinking. And it's paralyzing for someone to, feel caught by all of this. And I also recommend people look at the little things. If you've got a kid who's got 10 problems, but what you can solve today is homework adherence, solve homework adherence, and then feel good about it. And it's those baby step type approaches.
Thank you, Mike. And Jennifer, thank you for that question. I'd like to read two questions we got from parents a few minutes ago. The first one is, how do you find a behavioral parent trainer? And the second one is, regarding diet, what are your thoughts about gabapentin?
I'm sorry, it was gabapentin?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, that's easy. I don't have any thoughts about gabapentin. And I'm one of those rare people who work in academia that I am totally comfortable saying when I don't know diddly squat about something. So that's something that I can say I don't know the diddly squat. The first question, this is the issue. I was touching on this earlier. I didn't have time to really get into the diagnostic process. I did touch on this idea that it's doc shopping. It's being aware that some physicians don't know what they're dealing with, that it's okay to get the diagnosis, but then you got to be careful about what people recommend. Treatment is patchwork. I think you're hoping that I'll say, oh yes, there's a list of resources, go look here. For 20 years, both I and my staff have consistently looked at what's available in Connecticut, what organizations are there to be able to make sense of the practitioners and the providers. No one has ever put these things together. Even at Hartford Healthcare, where I've worked for 21 years, we do not have an ADHD treatment center. What you typically see, and this is the long picture, is you see providers move into an area and move out of an area. You see 2 or 3 centers that exist. You see web pages that you have to be an informed consumer in order to say, do they say something that sounds like behavioral parent training? When you call, you need to specifically ask, what do you offer in terms of your treatment? Oh, you're a neurofeedback treatment solo practitioner, and you say you might be able to do behavioral parent training? Thank you, but no thank you. It's difficult. What I would recommend to everybody is that they embrace one of the unfortunate but positive side effects of the pandemic. Lots of providers have gone virtual. So I would look nationwide for what you can't find in your backyard to try to find groups who are perfectly willing to do diagnostic interviews and to do group therapy and stuff via this type of an environment. Most people will agree that it's not perfect substitute, but I think a lot of people are comfortable enough with it. It took a long time, and it comes down a lot of times to issues of reimbursement, and that's the final whammy. You ask how to find a specific practitioner with behavioral parent training. And what I'm going to throw back at you is that all of these treatments have the typical struggle of being covered by insurance or not. And we're often limited to only what insurance will cover. So when that happens, maybe you don't want medication for your kid, but it's worth going to a center whose staff or physicians specialize in medication because they also have a few slots for doing behavioral parent training. Maybe you consider the medications and the behavioral parent training as well, but don't get scared off if there's something that seems like they're pushing medications and only dabbling in something else if that's your only source. Because there are ways to bundle payments for certain things that you might actually get insurance to pay for. Very few of us have the means to pay for these things out of pocket.
What are the long-term effects of a stimulant medication? And is there a reason to be concerned with kids starting in their teens and then taking long into adulthood?
This is a great question. This is where research really does give us very clear answers. I'll just go down a checklist. Concerns about height, weight, and growth. These are stimulants. They can be sort of appetite suppressive. If you don't eat and your nutrition goes a little bit down, you're worried about a kid's development. It's real, but it's small. And what people typically have shown is that if you have a kid who needs medication and you agree that it benefits them and helps them focus in school or things like that, if it's possible, you want to consider like summer medication holidays, because there's pretty convincing evidence that kids who have those drug holidays kind of catch up by the end. You don't need to worry about it. There's a slightly scarier concern that people say, but yeah, fine, I don't really care if Johnny weighs 5 pounds less. What I'm worried about is going to mess up his brain. Interesting. But in 2007 was a study from the National Institutes of Health intramural program that was the first suggestion that medications might actually normalize brain structure differences in ADHD. And what we've seen, even in the most recent studies that have come out of these mega studies co-funded by the NIMH and the National Institute of Drug Abuse, there's a study underway now that started with 11,000, I think it was 11-year-olds. It was 11, not 12, 11-year-olds. And they're following them every year until they're going to hit 30, I'm thinking, by the time this is done. They're up to about age 16, 17 now. And they're this huge cohort to see the effects over time. Even though those kids have only gotten through like middle to mid to late adolescence, there's already research showing the same sort of thing. Medications seem to boost brain development in ADHD. So those are some of the concerns about development. Can we say that about everything? No. Can we say that about a cognition or a this or a behavior? No, we haven't studied everything about development in ADHD. But what we can do is we can say there's some signs that it's probably more helpful, and we don't see signs that it's hurtful. Moving on to another area, cardiovascular risk. Any type of medication makes you worry that it's not just affecting your growth, it's not affecting your brain, but what about your other big systems? Are you going to have a heart attack later in life? These stimulant drugs, because of the way that they work, do have the potential impact on cardiovascular health. Doesn't seem to be borne out in long-term studies. So it's more of a theoretical risk And maybe as far as to say if somebody had pre-existing cardiac health problems, that they might want to very carefully work at whether or not this is a good medication discussion with their physician. But by and large, using the cardiovascular risk as sort of a proxy for general medical, like negative things, there's nothing like that. And then finally, we've touched several times on how medications or any treatments at all intervened earlier in life tends to be protective about a whole host of things that are those negative things that were asked about just a minute ago, in terms of like kids being told you're going to be a loser, you're going to be a criminal, you're going to be hooked on drugs and stuff like that. Treatment seems to, and even the medication, seem to really be a buffer against those negative outcomes. I've said this a few times. We don't exactly know the mechanism. We can't point to the exact why. Everything from just believing you're doing better to actually changing the brain to do all of these things are topics of active research, trying to figure out how are these treatments exerting protective effects. I got to admit, the nerdy scientist side of me gets really interested and curious and excited about that. But the older I get, the more that I'm pretty comfortable knowing it's enough to know that there are treatments out there that make people's lives better. So while, I'm curious about the mechanism, I'll settle for the win by knowing that if I can get the right treatment to the right people with ADHD, this idea of matching optimal treatment, either medication or non-medication, to what's going on, so that we can take what is this grab bag. We don't really know these days which med's going to work for a kid, or if they don't respond to a med, who's going to respond to neurofeedback or cognitive training. If we can learn over the next 10 years to do that matching, we might really be able to make advances in even understanding those long-term risks. To understand that when people are getting the treatments or medications that they need, when will it go wrong? When should someone try a second-tier treatment rather than one that's recommended specifically for them? So I think that covers it. It covers the height and weight, the growth, the development, the protective factors, and even just the general health. I don't like meds. I don't take Tylenol, but I do recommend them because they are an effective treatment for medication. Or for ADHD, medication is an effective treatment.
Mike, this has been amazing. We have a few more questions even that I would love answers to, but that being said, we can make sure that everybody on this call and who signed up for this event will get the recording, and we will give you the email and contact information for Mike and for Julie, who is running studies. And I will say that one of my sons participated in the study last summer, and it was really fascinating. And I think that just as you were ending on what we will know in years to come and be able to help kids with this is something that maybe our kids can work out and contribute to now. Mm-hmm. So it's a good thing.
Let me actually expand on that, just one or 2 points. First, I'm more than comfortable and actually enjoy the break of being able to answer people's questions by email. We never end up having enough time in these things, and there are no stupid questions. So if people do want to reach out, if we haven't had a chance to touch on things, I know we didn't get to talk about the reward stuff as much as I promised that we would, and that's one of my favorite topics, but also anything else. The other thing that I'll mention more humorously than not, we love to tell ourselves that our kids participate in sort of big studies like this because they recognize deep down that they're helping. And I do believe a lot of them are proud of themselves from doing it. But to be fair, most of them really like getting a cool picture of their brain and the couple $100 that they get for their time. So they've got both those motivations to really drive them to the participation in the study.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to Julie for making this connection for us. Thank you to Manuela for helping moderate, and to the audience for coming and spending this time with us. This has been really, really informational, and I can't tell you how much we're grateful for your time and expertise. So thanks again, everybody. Have a good night.
Great. Thanks everybody for your interest.